All right, today we're going to take a fresh look at one of the most misunderstood figures in all of American history, Ulysses S. Grant. For generations, his real story has been kind of buried under layers of myth and just plain misinterpretation. So today, we're going to peel all that back.
For more than 100 years, this was pretty much the story of Grant, wasn't it? It got boiled down to these simple, really damaging labels. He was the brutal general, the failed president, the drunk. But how did the guy who literally saved the Union and fought for civil rights end up with a reputation like that?
So, how did it happen? Well, a huge piece of the puzzle is something called the lost cause narrative. And you gotta understand, this wasn't just some fond memory of the Old South. No, this was a deliberate, full on campaign to rewrite history, to make the Confederacy look heroic. And well, if you're going to build up your own heroes, you've got to tear down the other sides. Grant was target number one.
So before we get to the real story, let's start with the caricature, right? The version of Grant that this mythology helped create, the one that really dominated the 20th century. This is probably the Grant a lot of us first heard about.
Look at this. The popular myth is just a world away from the man that modern historians have uncovered. The so-called butcher, turns out he was a brilliant, forward-thinking strategist. The failure, this was a man with incredible resilience. And the incompetent president, he was actually a fierce, fierce advocate for civil rights. So to really understand the man, you have to go back to his life before the war. It's a time that's often just written off as, a string of failures. But it was actually the very thing that forged the leader he would become. We could call these his wilderness years. Just look at this timeline. He starts out fine. West Point serves with distinction in the war, but then he resigns and just hits a wall. He's a farmer, sells firewood on the street, ends up a clerk in his dad's shop. But here's the thing. This period wasn't about failure. It was formative. It stripped him of any ego, of any pretension, and it built this quiet, unbreakable resolve in him. He learned what it was like to have nothing, a lesson that would define his leadership later on. And during all this, was he some kind of political firebrand? Not at all. He didn't like slavery, sure, but he wasn't out there giving speeches. He was just a quiet, unassuming guy who, by 1860, was just trying to get by. Absolutely no one would have looked at him and thought, there's the savior of the nation. Because then the Civil War started, and that quiet clerk, well, he transformed. He became the exact military leader the Union had been desperately, desperately looking for. He was a general who actually knew how to win. From getting the nickname Unconditional Surrender at Fort Donelson all the way to his absolute masterpiece at Vicksburg, Grant just kept delivering victories others couldn't. Now, this is also where that butcher label comes from. His final campaigns had staggering, almost unbelievable casualties. But Grant wasn't being reckless. He was being modern. He understood a grim, horrible truth. The only way to end this war was to completely destroy the Confederate armies. It was about grim arithmetic, not bloodlust.
But this is what's so incredible about him. At Appomattox, in the very moment of his greatest victory, his mind immediately snapped from war to peace. He offered Lee's men generous terms and literally told his own troops to stop cheering. For Grant, it was never about revenge. It was about putting the country back together. And that vision of a reunified and more just nation, well, that's what defined his presidency. Now he had to wage a whole different kind of war, not on a battlefield, but a war against terror, a war for the soul of the country. As president, Grant did not back down from the fight for Reconstruction. He created the Department of Justice for the specific purpose of enforcing federal law and protecting civil rights. He signed the Enforcement Acts, which were aimed like a weapon right at the Ku Klux Klan, and he used federal troops to smash them. He was waging a federal war on domestic terror. And you know what? For a time, it actually worked. But, and this is a big but, his presidency was absolutely damaged by the corruption of the Gilded Age. Grant himself was an honest man, but he was way too trusting of the people he appointed. And huge scandals like the whiskey ring just wrecked his administration's reputation. It gave his enemies all the ammunition they needed for decades to come. So after leaving office, Grant's life takes another unbelievable turn. That same tendency to trust the wrong people, it would lead him straight to financial ruin and set the stage for one last, truly heroic act. You'd think the man could catch a break, but nope. Once again, his trusting nature was his downfall. He invested everything he had in a Wall Street firm with a guy who was hailed as a genius. Turns out it was all a massive Ponzi scheme. When it collapsed, Grant lost every single penny. The hero of the Union was broke.
And to try and cover the firm's debts, Grant had taken out a personal loan for this much, which was just a staggering, mind-boggling amount of money back then. He was totally impoverished, but he was dead set on paying it back.
As if things couldn't possibly get any worse, he was then diagnosed with terminal throat cancer. So now he's facing death and poverty. He decides on one last campaign. He's going to write his memoirs to provide for his wife Julia after he's gone. And that's when his old friend, the author Mark Twain, steps in. He sees how desperate Grant is, and he makes him this incredible, unheard-of publishing offer that would guarantee his family's future, but only if Grant could finish the book in time. And in this agonizing final race against time, racked with unbelievable pain, he did it. He finished the manuscript just a few days before he died. His memoirs became a massive bestseller, and they're still considered a masterpiece of military writing. His very last battle was a victory.
Just as Grant himself rewrote his own story in those final months, modern historians have finally started to rewrite his legacy, to look past all those old myths and see the man for who he really was.
And if you want to see just how dramatic that shift is, look at this chart. In C-SPAN's survey of presidential historians, where a lower number is better, Grant's ranking has just skyrocketed. In just 4 years, he jumped 13 spots, right into the top 20. I mean, that's not a small adjustment. That's a fundamental rewriting of his place in American history. So what's behind this massive change? It's all about focus. Historians are now looking past the Gilded Age scandals and giving him credit for his determined and, for his time, incredibly courageous fight for civil rights. His war on the KKK and his efforts to protect Black Americans, that is now seen as the central and the most heroic part of his entire presidency. Grant's story is just such a powerful reminder that history isn't set in stone. It's a living thing, and it's always being re-examined. His legacy shows us that what we choose to remember really depends on who gets to tell the story, and which parts of that story we decide are most important. It kind of makes you wonder, right? If a figure as huge as Grant can be so misunderstood for so long, what else have we gotten wrong?